All right, here we go with chapter 23, the digestive system. There are only 3 chapters on the final. It's going to be chapters 23, 24, and 25. So digestion, urinary system, and the reproductive system. So let's do the digestive system. As you go through the PowerPoint with the video and just the PowerPoint that's on Blackboard, you'll notice that I skipped over some slides. And that's because originally there are 81 slides, and not all those I'm going to talk about. So I've skipped some of the ones that I probably don't talk about, but it doesn't mean that you don't need to know any information on it. It's just in the interest of time, in the interest of uploading a large file, I took some of the slides out. Most of the digestive system has to do with the alimentary canal. Well, the function of the urinary system is to break foodstuff down to the smallest particle possible in order to absorb it into the body. So you're going to break down sugars into monosaccharides. Your body has to break down proteins into individual amino acids, and your body has to break down individual lipids into individual fatty acids and triglycerides. And it does that using this long tube known as the alimentary canal. The alimentary canal starts at the mouth and it ends at the anus. And then we have some accessory organs for the alimentary canal, and these accessory organs are producing secretions that will be dumped into the lumen of the alimentary canal. And the lumen of any type of tube is the tube is the empty part that's in the middle, where the food stuff passes through. The food passes through the lumen. So we have the alimentary canal. The main parts of the alimentary canal starts with the mouth and the oral cavity, which leads to the pharynx. We talked about the pharynx when we were in the respiratory system, with the oropharynx and the laryngopharynx, and then lead to another tube called the esophagus. And we're going to go through each individual part eventually in this PowerPoint, which is why it's so long. The esophagus leads to the stomach, and then the stomach leads to the small intestine, and then the small intestine leads to the large intestine. Now, it's not just one tube without any stops. There are valves, also known as sphincters, that are in between each part. For example, there is a sphincter between the esophagus and the stomach. It's called the cardiac valve, or the cardiac sphincter. And the valve between the stomach and the small intestine is called the pyloric valve, so on and so forth. And we'll go through these valves as we make our way through the alimentary canal. The purpose of these valves is to prevent stuff from moving through too fast, and they also prevent too much of something to move to the next section. For example, the food stuff that's moving from the stomach into the small intestine. The stomach contents has a pH of about 1 to 2, which is highly acidic, and the pH of the small intestine is 8, which is slightly alkaline. So there has to be a way to only allow a little bit of the stuff from the stomach to go into the small intestine so that it can be buffered, so that we can buffer the pH up to about 8. All right, then the accessory organs that are going to help. We have the teeth. They don't produce a secretion, but they do help with the digestion. And then we have the tongue. The tongue, they're all both in the oral cavity. Then we have the gallbladder that will squirt bile, which is used to break down fats into the small intestine. Then we have salivary glands that will have some enzymes to help break things down. Plus, there's also a binding type of saliva so that you swallow one lump instead of many little lumps. And then we have the liver, which is the largest internal organ. And we have the pancreas. We talked about the pancreas when we were in the endocrine system. The pancreas is an endocrine and an exocrine gland. The exocrine function of the pancreas is to produce digestive enzymes. Make sure when you look at this picture on here with the video that you're also looking at this picture on the regular PowerPoint, because for some reason when I upload these PowerPoints onto the program to record a video, the pictures don't look the same and none of them are labeled. It's not like that in the physiology class. It just seems to do that with the anatomy class, so lucky you. Alright, we're going to follow the dot. We're going to go into the oral cavity. This is where the alimentary canal begins, basically. So food stuff goes into the mouth, and then it goes to the pharynx, and then it goes to the esophagus. The esophagus goes through the neck, and then it goes down through the chest, goes through the diaphragm, and then it empties into the stomach. So here's the stomach, upper left quadrant, and then the stomach will pass the contents into the small intestine. So the longest part of the alimentary canals is all of this small intestine, which is highly coiled and kinked up, and then the small intestine passes that stuff into the large intestine, which is right here, also known as the colon. And then the large intestine will pass it out until eventually we get to the anus. So as a quick review, we separate the abdomen into quadrants. You take a vertical line that starts at the xiphoid process. It goes straight down to the navel until it reaches the middle of the pubic bone where the pubic symphysis is. And then you take a horizontal line on the very top of one iliac crest and you go through the umbilicus again. And then you go to the other iliac crest. And it separates the abdomen into quadrants. Anything above the horizontal line is going to be an upper quadrant, and then anything on the right or left side, according to the patient, will be a right quadrant or a left quadrant. So the right upper quadrant is going to be on your left, and then the left upper quadrant is going to be on your right, but it's on your patient's left. Then we have the right lower quadrant, which is going to be on your left. Lower quadrant, though, stays the same. And then we have the left lower quadrant. As we go through the alimentary canal, when we get to the abdomen, we're going to talk about what some of these quadrants have. For example, in the upper right quadrant, we have the liver, and we have the gallbladder. In the upper left quadrant, we have the spleen. We talked about that with the lymphatic system. And then we also have the stomach. And then in the lower right quadrant, we're going to have the appendix, and we also have the cecum of the large intestine. Not a whole lot going on in the left lower quadrant, so we won't say much about that. A little bit of review from Chapter 1. The abdominal pelvic cavity is also known as the peritoneal cavity, and the tissues that surround those organs in the abdomen are called peritoneal tissues or peritoneum. And the peritoneum, which is a serous membrane, do you remember what that means? If anything is a serous membrane, that means it's producing a serous fluid. And a serous fluid is thin, it is watery, and it's a lubricant. This allows your gut, the organs that are in your gut, to not rub up against each other. The intestines are constantly moving food stuff around, so they're constantly bumping into the other intestines that are around them. And if that happens, if there's no serous fluid, then they can stick to each other. They can create friction and heat and pain, and we don't want that. But the peritoneum has two layers to it. There's a visceral peritoneum, and it's actually on the surface of the organs, or there's a parietal peritoneum, which lines the body wall. And then there's a potential space between the parietal and the visceral peritoneum, and that is the peritoneal cavity. So the peritoneal cavity is where we have the serous fluid. That looks weird. Anyway, serous fluid, S-E-R-O-U-S. Sometimes there are some structures that are behind the parietal peritoneum, and it does not have a visceral peritoneum. They call those structures retroperitoneal. The kidneys are behind the parietal peritoneum, so the kidneys are retroperitoneal, which we'll discuss again when we get to the next chapter. There are layers of tissue that help keep your internal organs in place in the abdomen. These tissues are called mesentery. They're also known as omentum. So sometimes you see that in anatomy books. Mesentery or omentum. Anyway, they help hold the organs in place. They help protect the organs with a fatty layer. They also hold blood vessels in place and nerves in place inside of the abdomen, so they're not just floating around willy-nilly. So in this picture here, we can see some of the mesentery right here that's between the liver and the stomach. They've cut it, but there's also some that is right here. I wish they had a picture of this in this PowerPoint, but they do not. But there is a layer of mesentery that lays right here on the bottom part of the stomach, and it covers all of the intestines. It forms what they call a fatty apron, but it's all around the front of the abdomen. And anytime you have abdominal surgery, like if you want to remove the appendix, which is right there, or blockage of something in the abdomen, anytime you have any type of abdominal surgery, that mesentery will scar. It will or create scar tissue. If you have enough abdominal surgeries, the scar tissue will build up, and it causes pain because the scar tissue does not move at all. So as you move and stretch, if it pulls on some of the tissues, it creates a lot of pain and friction. So then you might have to have another surgery just to remove the scar tissue. There are about 5 or 6 processes that go into digestion system. So let's talk about some of these, and they're just strict definitions. First, there's ingestion. Ingestion just means putting it in your mouth. So when you tear off a piece of food, put it in your mouth, that's called ingestion. Then we have propulsion. Propulsion is the forward movement of the foodstuff. You kind of always want stuff to move forward. To move backwards would be counterproductive and actually kind of gross. So you just want everything to move forward. The forward movement for most of the alimentary canal is called peristalsis. Now this is going to be for the entire, we're going to talk about all these processes like it's everything in the alimentary canal that does everything, all of these processes, but this doesn't all occur in every part. Peristalsis occurs in most of the alimentary canal until we get to the large intestine, and then they're called mass movements. So whenever there are exceptions to the rule, we'll get to that when we start going through the different parts of the alimentary canal. All right, so we had propulsion, which is the movement of food, and the name for the wave-like propulsion is called peristalsis, and this is because of the smooth muscle. So don't forget that. Anytime it's a hollow tube, the muscle of the hollow tube is smooth muscle, which is involuntary. So propulsion, peristalsis. Then we have the mechanical breakdown. The term breakdown is digestion. So the term digestion means to break down, and there's two types of digestion. There's mechanical digestion, and then there's chemical digestion, and chemical digestion we'll mention on the next slide. But mechanical digestion is physically tearing something apart, using your teeth, like chewing and churning the food in the stomach, mixing it with as many enzymes as possible, just a sort of a mixing motion, chewing motion. That's a mechanical breakdown, physical breakdown. And then we have segmentation. Segmentation is a type of mechanical digestion, but it's also a type of movement. So in some anatomy books, segmentation is also listed as a type of propulsion. But instead of propelling it all the way forward, segmentation is a back and forth movement of the food stuff that's moving through the alimentary canal. We have pictures of it later, so you'll be able to see it. But segmentation is a mixing motion. Peristalsis is a forward moving motion. And like I said on the earlier slide, digestion is to break something down into a smaller part. We had mechanical digestion, but we also have chemical digestion. Chemical digestion is breaking food down on the molecular level, breaking chemical bonds. That's how we go from polysaccharides to disaccharides to monosaccharides. Monosaccharides are simple sugars. We cannot absorb anything unless it's in the smallest unit possible. So sugars are broken down to monosaccharides. Proteins are broken down to amino acids. Fats are broken down to fatty acids and triglycerides. Absorption is moving something from the lumen of the canal to inside of the body. Anything that's in the lumen of the alimentary canal is not considered to be inside of the body until it passes through a membrane. It passes through the apical surface of the lumen. For example, if you swallowed a metal ball, a small metal marble, it would pass all the way through the alimentary canal, and then you would eventually pass it through your anus because you're not going to break it down and digest it. So as long as it's in the lumen, it's not considered to be inside of the body, not until it passes through the membrane into your circulation. So absorption is the moving of these small particles like monosaccharides and amino acids into your circulation. And then anything that is not digestible, anything that's still left in the lumen when it gets to the large intestine, that's going to be feces, and then we have to eliminate it. The process of elimination is called defecation. All right, let's follow the red dot. You put food in your mouth, that's ingestion. So ingestion only occurs in the mouth. Ingestion is not going to occur down here at the anus, so don't mix that up. Ingestion occurs in the mouth. That's where you start chewing. And when you chew food up, that's mechanical digestion. Mix that food with saliva. Saliva has enzymes to break chemical bonds, so chemical digestion also begins in the oral cavity. And then you swallow. So then the food stuff passes through the esophagus, gets into the stomach. So in the stomach we have more digestion going on, more mechanical digestion, segmentation. We have more chemical digestion with the gastric juice. And then the food stuff is passed into the small intestine. So again, we might have some more digestion occurring here, but now we have absorption. We're absorbing the nutrients into capillaries, which are going to either be blood capillaries or Lymphatic capillaries. We talked about lymphatic capillaries in the small intestine. They're called lacteals. And lacteals transport absorbed fats and only fats. As soon as the fat enters into the lacteal, it's called chyle, C-H-Y-L-E. And then the chyle is transported to the circulatory system through the rest of the lymphatic vessels. Small intestine leads to the large intestine. And once we're in the large intestine, very little is still going to be digested. There's still very little that's going to be absorbed. We're going to absorb mostly water and electrolytes. There is some bacteria, it's called flora, bacterial flora in the large intestine, and it can break some stuff down even smaller, but usually it's just to absorb any type of vitamins or minerals that are still left over. Definitely going to absorb water. And then from the large intestine, this is now feces, and then we have defecation, eliminating the residues to, well, wherever you choose to be, wherever you go to the bathroom. Hopefully it's on a toilet. All right, let me just mention one other thing. Whenever you take food, put it in your mouth and chew it up and swallow it, the term for the food stuff that's chewed up and mixed with saliva and swallowed is called bolus. B-O-L-U-S. Let me write that down. B-O-L-U-S. Bolus is a lump of food that's going to pass through the esophagus and then go into the stomach. Once it goes into the stomach, it's no longer called bolus. Once it mixes with the gastric juice, it's called chyme, C-H-Y-M-E. So then chyme is going to pass through the stomach. Chyme goes into the small intestine. And when the chyme goes into the large intestine, that means that stuff's not digestible and absorbable for the most part. So the stuff in the large intestine, they're called feces. So we go from bolus to chyme. Chyme is a soupy mixture, and then feces, which starts out as a soupy mixture, not to be too gross, but then as the large intestine absorbs water, they compact it, so you pass something a little more solid. All right, like I mentioned before, one of the processes is propulsion for digestion, and the main method of propulsion is called peristalsis. Peristalsis is a wave-like pattern that the smooth muscle will do. We have muscles all around the lumen. The muscles that are behind the bolus or the chyme will contract, and then the muscles in front of the chyme and the bolus are going to relax. So as the muscles behind the bolus contract, they propel and push the food stuff forward, which is peristalsis. Segmentation is another type of movement, but it's a mixing motion. This is for mechanical digestion. With segmentation, we have alternating parts of the muscles that are going to alternate at different times, and then it will contract in the middle of the bolus, and then through the middle again, and it does a mixing motion. The best way I can describe this is if you take a tube of toothpaste and hold it in both hands, one end of the tube of the toothpaste in one hand and the other tube of toothpaste in the other hand. And then you just alternate squeezing, right hand, left hand, right hand, left hand. And you're mixing the toothpaste in the middle of the tube back and forth. Make sure you don't have the cap on if you're actually trying this at home, because then you're going to have a mess of toothpaste all over the floor. But anyway, whenever you alternate squeezing the right hand, left hand, right hand, left hand, you're mixing up the toothpaste that's in the tube. That's the same principle here. Mixing it up, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. That is called segmentation. When it comes to the tissues of the alimentary canal, there are 4 layers to these tissues. We'll start with the innermost layer, the one that lines the lumen. This will be the layer that's closest to the food stuff. And then we'll end with the layer that's on the outside, which is going to be the visceral peritoneum. So the layer that's the closest to the middle is called the mucosa. I'll fill in some of these later here in just a second, but let's just go through this slide. So we have the mucosa. There are 3 layers to the mucosa. First, there's going to be an epithelium. Then there's something called a lamina propria. And then there's a muscle called the muscularis mucosae. All right, let's write some stuff down. Most of the epithelium of the mucosa is simple columnar. So most of the epithelium of the alimentary canal is simple columnar. Those places where it's different, it's going to be a stratified squamous. Any opening to the outside is lined with stratified squamous. I don't know if you remember that when we talked about tissues or not. But anyway, since it's the lining of the inside, it's going to be non-keratinized, stratified squamous epithelium. However, most of it's going to be simple columnar. Underneath the simple columnar is a piece of connective tissue known as the lamina propria. It acts like a basement membrane. And then there's a piece of muscle. This muscle is called muscularis mucosae. It's a smooth muscle, and right next to the muscularis mucosae is going to be the next layer, which is the submucosa. The muscularis mucosae is going to help with peristalsis. It helps and assists with segmentation, but you'll see that there's about 16 feet of gut inside of the body. It's not just a straight line. It is kinked and curled up, and that is because of the muscularis mucosae. It keeps it nice and tight so that it doesn't relax. If it relaxed, then it would just burst out of the body, and that only happens after death. That's another story altogether. I'm sorry, I got so morbid. All right, now the next layer is called the submucosa. So we had the mucosa, now we have the submucosa. And in the submucosa, that's where we're going to have the blood vessels for the transport of the nutrients that have been absorbed. So there are blood vessels there, and there are lymphatic vessels as well. The third layer is called the muscularis externa. We already had one muscle called the muscularis mucosae, and that's in the mucosal layer. So the muscularis externa is between the submucosa and the serosa. Most of the time in the alimentary canal, there's only two layers of muscles in muscularis externa. There's an inner layer called the circular muscle, and then an outer layer that is the longitudinal muscle. I'm going to write a couple of things down about those. The inner circular muscles, they form valves. They're the ones that form sphincters. The circular muscles are responsible for segmentation. I'm just going to put seg. So that mixing motion is due to relaxing and contracting different parts of the circular muscle. The longitudinal muscle is responsible for peristalsis. I'm just going to put peri. But it is responsible for the forward moving propulsion of peristalsis. All right, and then the last layer is called the serosa. And the serosa, that's the outermost layer, is a visceral peritoneum. Now, some parts of the alimentary canal do not have a serosa. If they don't have a serosa, then it is an anchoring tissue called an adventitia. So an adventitia is an anchoring tissue. For example, the esophagus, most of the upper part of the esophagus is surrounded by an adventitia, not a serosa. That way, the outer layers of the esophagus can encroach and anchor on the tissues that are surrounding it so that your esophagus is not flopping around inside of the neck or the thoracic cavity. All right, so on here, we're going to follow the dot. So this is the lumen of the alimentary canal. This is where the food stuff is passing through. And then we have this layer right here. This layer is called the mucosa. The mucosa. The mucosa is all of this right here. Here is the epithelium. This is going to be mostly the simple columnar epithelium. And then the lamina propria right here. You'll see that there's some lymphatic tissue in the lamina propria. These are known as Peyer's patches. And then here's the muscularis mucosae. So all three of these are all parts of the mucosal layer, which is closest to the foodstuff in the lumen. The next tissue layer is right here, which is the submucosa. This is where the capillaries lead to, the blood capillaries and lymph capillaries. These larger blood vessels are found in the submucosa right here. And then the next layer, these are going to be the muscularis externa layers. And there's two layers. There's an inner circular layer. And look at the direction of the fibers. They go around their circumference. So whenever they contract, they narrow the lumen so they can create the valves and sphincters, plus they also do the segmentation. And then the outer muscle layer, these are the longitudinal. And the longitudinal muscle layers go along the length in this direction right here, not around the width, but along the length. So that whenever these muscles contract, they're pushing the foodstuff forward. So inner circular, outer longitudinal. And then the very, very thin layer on the outside, this is the serosa, also known as the visceral peritoneum. Now, the nerve supply to most of the alimentary canal is a part of the enteric nervous system. There are some books that will separate the enteric nervous system separate from the rest of the autonomic nervous system. And this book did not, so it's all considered the same. But anyhow, parts of the enteric nervous system include the myenteric nerve plexus, and then we have the submucosal nerve plexus. The myenteric nerve plexus is between the circular and longitudinal muscles, so those are the muscles that it's going to go to. So it innervates the circular and longitudinal muscles, which means the myenteric nerve plexus is responsible for peristalsis and segmentation. The submucosal nerve plexus is going to innervate the muscularis mucosae, which is not listed down here, but also the submucosal nerve plexus will innervate the glands for secretion. We have mucose glands to produce mucus that line the inside of the alimentary canal, and then we also have some cells along the submucosa that produce hormones. All right, now we're going to work our way through the alimentary canal and talk about each structure. We'll start with the mouth and the oral cavity, and then we'll end with the last part of the large intestine, which will be the anal canal and the anus. And then we'll talk about the accessory organs. We'll focus on the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. And then we're done with the digestive system. So the mouth is a part of the oral cavity. That's where you put the food into your mouth. This is where ingestion occurs. The one thing I want to mention about this is going to be the palate and then the tongue. The palate is the roof of your mouth, and you'll notice that it's kind of grooved in the roof of the mouth, and that helps grip and grasp the food as you're chewing it. The palate's separated into a hard palate and a soft palate. The hard palate's where we have the hard bone. Part of it is the maxillary bone, and another part of it is the palatine bone, if you remember that from lab on bones. Then the other structure inside of the mouth, other than the teeth, is the tongue. The tongue has taste buds on the surface of the tongue to help. Those are chemoreceptors, if you remember that from the special senses chapter. And these chemoreceptors will pick up on the different ions that are inside of the mouth. It'll pick up on sodium and chloride ions, and then you can tell that that is a salty taste. It'll pick up on hydrogen ions, which will give it a sour taste, so on and so forth. So we have the palate, which is the roof of the mouth, and the tongue to help keep the food in between the teeth. Plus, the tongue can also help clean the teeth afterwards, getting the food out that are stuck in the grooves. It's not entirely perfect, though. You still need to use dental floss. Earlier, when we were listing the different layers of the alimentary canal, we said the mucosa has an epithelium of simple columnar epithelium. The mucosa in the mouth is going to be stratified squamous epithelium, and it makes sense with all the chewing going on, all the ingestion, and then the mechanical digestion. You're going to lose the top layer of cells, so that's why it's lined with the non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. All right, in this picture here we can see the hard palate. Anywhere we see bone that's part of the hard palate, here's the maxillary bone. Then we get back here is the palatine bone, and then this back here is the soft palate. The soft palate is soft tissue only. The very end of the soft palate ends in the uvula, U-V-U-L-A. The soft palate actually does have a purpose, other than just dangle down the back of the mouth. Whenever you chew food up and you swallow it, as soon as that food stuff touches the soft palate, it lifts up, and it covers and completely closes off the nasal cavity, so that as you swallow, food or water goes down and not up into the nasal cavity, because that would be bad. All right, so here's the soft palate, and there's the uvula. Here's the tongue. The tongue is made of many different muscles in different directions to help keep food between the teeth. The tongue is also used to articulate your words. And then we see the teeth, which we'll go through here in just a second. The teeth are responsible for grasping and tearing and grinding. When it comes to teeth, there are two types of teeth. There's deciduous teeth, and then there's permanent teeth. So if you had to guess which one falls out and which one stays as an adult, then you can pretty much guess by the word permanent. Your permanent teeth are your adult's teeth. The deciduous teeth are your baby teeth, and they start first appearing around the 6 months of age. You have 20 that are going to be deciduous teeth, and then they're replaced by your adult permanent teeth. A little bit of trivia, The order in which you get your baby teeth is the same order that you will lose the baby teeth to have the adult teeth grow in. And then as an adult, you have 32 teeth, even in Arkansas. All right. There are 3 parts to a tooth. You have a crown, you have a neck, which is not listed on the PowerPoint, and then you have a root. The crown is the part of the tooth that is above the gum line. The root is the part that's in the tooth socket. Remember the name of the special joint between the tooth and the socket? It's called a gomphosis joint. A gomphosis joint is a fibrous joint because the fibers between the tooth and the socket is called the periodontal ligament. Anyway, that's a little bit of review. So the crown is the part of the tooth above the gum line. The root is the part of the tooth that's in the tooth socket. The layer of tissue that's on the outside of the crown is called enamel. Enamel has a white color to it. It is the strongest substance in the body. It is harder than bone. The tissue that's underneath the enamel is called dentin, and dentin goes all the way down from the crown into the root. So dentin is the whole tooth, and dentin has a yellow color to it. So as you lose enamel, then you see the yellow coming through of the dentin. And in the center of the tooth is a cavity called the pulp cavity. The pulp cavity has a blood supply inside there, and as well as a nerve supply. All right, here's the tooth. The part of the tooth that is above is right here's the crown. I guess I can try to draw a little bracket. That is the crown of the tooth. The neck is the part that's actually in the gum line, so that's the neck. And then the root is the part that's in the bone itself. So crown, neck, and then root. The tissue that's on the outside, that is the enamel. Outside here, it's only on the crown. Dentin, I'm just going to go back to the yellow red light. Here's the dentin, and it goes all the way around the tooth, so that's the dentin. Here's the pulp cavity in the very center, right here has the blood supplies and the nerve supply. And then just a little bit of trivia. This is the periodontal ligament right here, which is why the gomphosis joint is a fibrous joint. Also associated with the oral cavity are your salivary glands. The salivary glands produce a wet secretion known as saliva. And there's 2 types of saliva. There's serous, S-E-R-O-U-S, and mucose, M-U-C-O-U-S. The serous saliva is thin and watery and full of enzymes. These enzymes are mostly carbohydrate enzymes called amylase. And amylase breaks down amylose, which is a complex sugar. So carbohydrate digestion begins in the mouth. If the saliva is a mucose saliva, that means it's mostly thick and it's a binding type of saliva. Because even though you're chewing food apart to break it down, you're going to swallow it as one bolus, which is the mucose secretion, keeping it all together as a binder. Now, there are 3 main salivary glands. The parotid glands are the largest of the salivary glands. They are anterior to your ear. The parotid glands produce a mostly serous saliva, which means it is mostly full of enzymes. Whenever you see something sugary, some of you may have experienced this, and you crave the sugar because maybe your blood sugar is getting low. But there's something called the feed-forward mechanism in the nervous system. This feed-forward mechanism prepares the body for the food you're about to eat. So when you see food that you want, your mouth starts to salivate, and that is part of the feed-forward mechanism. Well, sometimes when you see something sweet, you get a little pain in the front of the ears because the parotid gland has produced a lot of saliva that's pushing its way through the parotid duct. The next salivary gland is called submandibular salivary gland. It's called submandibular because it is below the mandible, so it's below your lower jaw. The submandibular saliva is a mixed saliva. It is equal parts serous and mucose saliva. And then the last main salivary gland are called sublingual salivary glands, and so they are in or underneath the tongue. And the saliva from the sublingual salivary gland is mostly mucose. It's mostly thick. All right, so right here is the parotid salivary gland. Produces a mostly serous saliva emptied into this parotid duct right here. The submandibular salivary gland is right here. It's underneath the mandible, and it's producing a secretion that is mixed serous and mucose secretions. And then right here is the sublingual salivary gland producing mostly mucose saliva. So after you swallow the bolus, it moves into the pharynx. Now there are three parts to the pharynx that we talked about in the respiratory system. We have the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. Since we're not ingesting food through the nose, we're going to bypass the nasopharynx and start with the oropharynx. The oropharynx is the part of the pharynx that is behind the oral cavity, and then the laryngopharynx is the part of the pharynx that's right around or adjacent and superior to the larynx, which is your voice box. The thing about this passageway is that's all it is about passageways, and it is lined with stratified squamous epithelium. Those parts of the alimentary canal, the upper parts where we're going to have food and water, as well as maybe air, they're going to be lined with stratified squamous epithelium. Then this is going to be a non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. Now, the other thing about the pharynx is that between the laryngopharynx and the esophagus is something called a pharyngeal constrictor, and it acts like a valve. And it stays closed all the time until you swallow, and then it opens up to allow the bolus to pass into the esophagus. So now we're going to talk about the esophagus. The esophagus is a tube, and it goes from the pharynx to the stomach. The esophagus will go through the neck. It goes through the thoracic cavity. It passes through the diaphragm before it becomes and joins with the stomach. So the valves and sphincters associated with the esophagus. The upper valve is known as the pharyngeal constrictor. We just talked about that in the last slide. The lower valve of the esophagus is known as the cardiac sphincter or the cardiac valve. So this cardiac valve separates the esophagus from the stomach. Now this valve is actually really important because the gastric contents inside the stomach have a pH of about 1 to 2, which is going to fry your tissues. So the cardiac sphincter stays closed at all times until the bolus hits it, and it opens up, allows the bolus to pass through, and then closes right back up so that the gastric contents don't regurgitate back up into the esophagus. If it does, that creates what we call a hiatal hernia, and you can feel it as heartburn. The upper part of the esophagus is lined with non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, and then as we get down closer to the stomach, it starts to transition. So this is where the epithelium of the mucosa starts to transition and eventually becomes simple columnar. So the bottom part, the most inferior part of the esophagus, is lined with simple columnar epithelium, and then it stays simple columnar epithelium until we get to the anal canal. And then, like I mentioned before, the outermost layer of the alimentary canal is known as a serosa. And if it's not a serosa, then it's an adventitia. So here's where we first mentioned the adventitia, and it's an encroaching or an anchoring tissue, and that will help keep the organs still. All right, the next stop in the alimentary canal is the stomach. So the stomach is from the esophagus to the small intestine. The stomach is basically a J-shaped sac, and it's in the upper left quadrant. So the stomach's in the upper left quadrant. It produces secretions known as gastric juice, and we'll go over the parts of gastric juice in a few minutes. Now, carbohydrate digestion began in the mouth. Protein digestion begins in the stomach. So there's an enzyme that is produced by the gastric cells that breaks down proteins into individual amino acids. Now, the time it takes to put food in your mouth and chew it up and swallow it, it varies from person to person. You've seen those people who refuse to chew and they just swallow it. Anyhow, that takes seconds. In the stomach, food stays in the stomach about 4 hours. It could be up to 6 hours. It depends on the composition of the food that you're eating. The more carbohydrates that are in the stomach or the meal, then the faster it's going to move through the stomach. The more protein, it burns longer, which is why you feel full longer when you eat a more protein meal than a more carbohydrate meal. And then fatty meals stay in the stomach the longest of all. There are 4 regions to the stomach. We have the cardiac region. They said cardial. This is the first time I've ever seen it like that. Usually it's the cardiac region. The cardiac region has a valve associated with it, and that is the cardiac valve. That's why it's called the cardiac valve, because the next region of the stomach is known as the cardiac region. So this is the first place that food is going to hit, is on the cardiac region of the stomach. Above the cardiac region is a dome-shaped part of the stomach. It's called the fundus. Anytime there's a dome on an organ, it's called the fundus. And the fundus is for the temporary storage of food. So the only time you're actually going to have food stuff in the fundus is if you eat more than what you should, when you're past being full, which is what I do every time I eat a pizza buffet. Anyway, so that's the fundus for temporary storage of food. The main part of the stomach is called the body of the stomach, and this is where most stomach digestion occurs. Not most digestion in all of the alimentary canal, but in the stomach, this is the most digestion in the stomach occurs in the body. And then the very last part of the stomach before it goes into the small intestine is known as the pylorus, or the pyloric region. So the pylorus is the last part. There's going to be an antrum, there's a canal, and there's a valve. So the valve between the stomach and the small intestine is known as the pyloric valve. So I mentioned earlier that the cardiac valve, which is going to be right here, this cardiac valve is between the esophagus and the stomach. This valve stays closed, and it's an important valve because it prevents the gastric contents from inside the stomach from going back up into the esophagus and burning those tissues. The other valve associated with the stomach is right here, is the pyloric valve. The pyloric valve is also very important. It only allows about 30 milliliters of chyme to pass from the stomach into the small intestine. We mentioned chyme earlier. Bolus, which is the food that you swallowed, once it goes into the stomach, it's mixed with gastric juice. Now it's called chyme. It's more of a soupy mixture. And chyme, by the time it works down to the pyloric region, the pyloric valve is only going to open up and allow about 30 milliliters of chyme to pass at a time. That way you don't overwhelm the first part of the small intestine with too much chyme, because too much chyme is going to burn. You have to have time in order to buffer the chyme, and that's where the secretions from the pancreas come into play. Plus, there's also a layer of mucus that lines the inner lining, and mucus has bicarbonate in it, which is a buffer. All right, so the regions of the stomach, we have the cardiac region, which is going to be right here. It's the one closest to the opening into the esophagus. The fundus is going to be the dome part up here. And then most of it right here is going to be the body, where most digestion in the stomach occurs. And here's the pyloric region inside here. You'll see on the inner lining of the stomach, it's not a flat surface. It's got grooves, and it's got hills and valleys, kind of like the surface of the brain. These grooves and valleys are called rugae. So inside, it is lined with rugae, and then as the stomach fills with food, the rugae will flatten out. It just increases the surface area inside of the stomach so that we can mix as much stuff inside the stomach with as much gastric juice as possible. Now let's talk about the muscularis externa. The muscularis externa is the outer layer of muscles. The stomach has 3 layers of the muscularis externa. The other places of the alimentary canal only have 2, inner circular and outer longitudinal. So the stomach also has a deep layer right here known as the oblique layer. So right here is the outer longitudinal muscle. Here's the middle circular muscle, and then we have an inner oblique muscle. There are curves associated with the stomach. There's a lesser curvature right here, and then we have the greater curvature, which is going to be right here. The top part of the fundus of the stomach is actually going to be right below the diaphragm. But we have other parts on the greater curvature where we have mesentery attached to it, and then there's mesentery attached to the lesser curvature as well, between the lesser curvature and the liver. As gross as this may be, this is looking inside of the stomach, putting a camera down inside somebody's throat until they swallow it, and then you can see the inner lining of the stomach. Now there's nothing in it, so this is empty, but we're looking up into the fundus, which is the dome part. We're going to be right up inside there. All along the rugae of the stomach, there are pits, and they're called gastric pits. The cells of the gastric pits are producing the secretions that are going to make gastric juice. So let's go over those parts. So inside the gastric pits, we have mucose cells. They're at the neck of the gastric pits, and they produce a mucus that is rich in bicarbonate. This is a very important layer of mucus. It gives the inner lining of the stomach protection. The enzymes that are breaking down the proteins can break down the tissues of your stomach or any tissues anywhere. So we want to protect your tissues from the gastric enzymes. So that's where the mucus comes into play. So mucose cells produce mucus. Then we have parietal cells. Parietal cells produce two types of secretions. It produces intrinsic factor. You can write this down. Intrinsic factor allows you to absorb vitamin B12 from your diet. Vitamin B12 is essential to making red blood cells. The only way you're going to get vitamin B12 is through your diet. Most of the time is through red meat, but you can get it through some certain vegetables like spinach. But anyway, the intrinsic factor allows you to, it binds to the vitamin B12 so that you can absorb it in your small intestine. So the problem with gastric bypass way back in the day when it first came around is that they bypassed the stomach completely. And then little did they know, but they're also bypassing your intrinsic factor so that those people became anemic pretty quick. So they had to get vitamin B12 injections so that they don't have to absorb it through their diet. The other secretion that comes from the parietal cells is known as hydrochloric acid, or HCl. The hydrochloric acid will break down pathogens and bacteria that you've swallowed, because no matter how much you try to clean your food, it's definitely not as clean as you would like it to be. So the hydrochloric acid can fry and bake and tear apart pathogens and bacteria for the most part. But hydrochloric acid is also going to activate something that we call zymogens. Zymogens are inactive protein enzymes. All protein enzymes are released inactive, and then they have to be activated later. If they were released activated, then they would go ahead and start digesting things, and it needs some time to activate so you don't digest your own tissues. The name of the main zymogen that comes from the gastric pits comes from the chief cells. The chief cells secrete pepsinogen, and pepsinogen is the inactive protein enzyme that will become pepsin. So how does pepsinogen become pepsin? It has to do with hydrochloric acid. Hydrochloric acid breaks down pepsinogen into the active form of pepsin, and pepsin is a protein enzyme, so it breaks down proteins into amino acids, which is why we say that protein digestion starts in the stomach. There is one more secretion that comes from the chief cells. So not only do the chief cells secrete pepsinogen, but they also secrete gastric lipase. So gastric lipase. That is a fat enzyme. So lipid digestion begins in the stomach, but it's not that effective. The most effective lipase is going to come from the pancreas, which is emptied into the small intestine. These are pictures here of the gastric pits. So we see there are like holes in the surface of the rugae, and those are the gastric pits and the cells of the gastric pits. All right, the next stop of the alimentary canal is the small intestine. There are three parts to the small intestine. There's the duodenum, also pronounced as the duodenum, either way, but most commonly is the duodenum. Then we have the jejunum, then we have the ileum, I-L-E-U-M. Those are the three parts of the small intestine. Inside the small intestine is where most digestion and most absorption occurs. Most digestion is in the duodenum. Most absorption is in the jejunum. So overall, the small intestine is the longest part of the alimentary canal, but specifically the longest part of the small intestine is going to be the ileum. So the duodenum, which we're going to go over here in just a minute, is the shortest section of the small intestine, and it's the most fixed, which means there's a lot of mesentery around it to keep it from moving around too much. After that, the jejunum and the ileum, they have free movement all around the abdominal cavity if they need to, as they fill with foodstuff, maybe even air, and then as they pass the foodstuff down into the large intestine. So the duodenum is the first part. It is the smallest and most fixed. The jejunum is where most absorption occurs. So the jejunum actually has more blood vessels to it than the rest of the alimentary canal. It has a more pink color to it compared to the other sections of the small intestine. And then the ileum. By the time the chyme moves into the ileum, most of it's been digested, most of it's been absorbed. So there's not a whole lot moving on here, but definitely more than when we get to the large intestine. The ileum is full of Peyer's patches, which is lymphatic tissue to help get rid of any pathogens that have made it past the stomach and into the small intestine. Now, the reason why most digestion occurs in the duodenum is because it receives most of the digestive enzymes from the pancreas. The pancreatic enzymes are more powerful than the enzymes that come from saliva or the enzymes that are in gastric juice. And then we also have bile. Bile came from the gallbladder, and bile is going to break down the fats. So we're going to find some structures in the duodenum that we're not going to find anywhere else in the small intestine. The pancreas empties into the small intestine through a duct called the main pancreatic duct. There's also a smaller duct called the accessory duct, and we'll show you a picture in just a minute. And then the common bile duct also enters into the duodenum. The main pancreatic duct and the common bile duct come together, and they're going to enter at a valve or sphincter located at the duodenum called the hepatopancreatic sphincter. I'm going to write that down. Hepato, which means liver, pancreatic, valve or sphincter. So the main pancreatic duct and the common bile duct come together and empty through the hepatopancreatic valve or hepatopancreatic sphincter into the duodenum. There are two bumps inside of the duodenum called the major and the minor papilla. The major papilla is where we find the hepatopancreatic valve or hepatopancreatic sphincter. It controls the entry of the pancreatic enzymes plus the pancreatic bicarbonate plus the bile from the common bile duct. So here's the duodenum. This is where the pyloric valve would be, between that and the stomach. Here's the duodenum. And then as soon as the duodenum curves around the pancreas, it becomes the jejunum. So here's the beginning of the jejunum right here. The rest of it, all of this is duodenum. If we look inside the duodenum, we see this hole. This is where the major papilla is. That's where the common bile duct empties into the duodenum. It's also where the main pancreatic duct, which I'm highlighting in the light here, empties into the duodenum. So most of the cells of the pancreas are called acinar cells, and these cells are producing the digestive enzymes. So the digestive enzymes will then empty through the main pancreatic duct, through the hepatopancreatic sphincter, and then the common bile duct is going to secrete bile through the hepatopancreatic sphincter as well. I want to note this small valve or this small duct right here called the accessory duct. Sometimes you may have heard of this, but the gallbladder, the bile inside the gallbladder, becomes small and hardened and forms a stone. It's called gallstones. So these gallstones can pass through the common bile duct and they get lodged right here at the hepatopancreatic sphincter and causes all kinds of pain and problems. But we still need the digestive enzymes that are going to do most of the digestion. So the digestive enzymes in the mucus or bicarbonate can then pass through the accessory duct into the duodenum. There are 3 modifications to the surface area of the small intestine. These modifications help increase the surface area so that we have as much absorption as possible. These modifications include folds on the inside, known as circular folds. They're also known as plica circularis, and that's how we're going to see them when we get to the physiology chapter or physiology semester. So we have circular folds. So instead of the inner lining being a straight line like this, it curves up and down like that. All right, so you know that this line is definitely a lot longer than that line right there. Anyway, so we have circular folds on the inside. The lining of the circular folds form finger-like projections called villi. So not only on top we have the circular folds, on top of the circular folds we have finger-like projections known as the villi. The villi are aligned with the simple columnar epithelium, also known as the absorptive enterocytes. They're absorbing the nutrients, the monosaccharides, and they're also absorbing the fatty acids and the amino acids. And then they pass them into the core of the villus. Inside of the core of the villus, we have capillaries, blood capillaries, and a lymphatic capillary known as a lacteal. And then on the surface of the absorptive enterocytes, on the simple columnar epithelium, we have hair-like extensions known as microvilli. And the microvilli, not only does it increase the surface area, It also does something known as contact digestion. That means there are enzymes that are made by the microvilli. They're on the surface of the microvilli, and whenever they touch the foodstuff as it passes through the small intestine, it breaks it down even further. So it has to touch the foodstuff in order to break it down. So that's the contact digestion. So we have circular folds, villi, and microvilli. All increase the surface area of the lumen so that we can absorb as much as possible. All right, if we look at some of the cells of the lining of the small intestine, we have the absorptive enterocytes, and those are the ones that are absorbing ions, absorbing nutrients into our bodies. And then we also have goblet cells that produce mucus to help lubricate the chyme, plus that also lubricates the inner wall so that the foodstuff doesn't stick to that inner wall. But then we have something called enteroendocrine cells. These enteroendocrine cells secrete hormones. And let's talk about the main hormones, or one of the main hormones that comes from the small intestine. It's abbreviated CCK, which is cholecystokinin. Let's see if I can spell it out here. All right, cholecystokinin is a hormone that has 3 functions and 3 targets. I don't have room to write it down, so you make sure you write it down. Cholecystokinin is going to target the gallbladder to make it contract. So cholecystokinin causes the gallbladder to contract. As soon as that chyme hits the first part of the small intestine or the duodenum, cholecystokinin is released. And cholecystokinin then goes back and makes the gallbladder contract so that it squirts some bile into the small intestine so that you can emulsify and break down fats. The other function of cholecystokinin is that it signals the pancreas to release the pancreatic enzymes. So not only does the gallbladder contract, the pancreas releases the pancreatic amylase, the pancreatic lipase, the pancreatic nuclease, the pancreatic inactive protein enzymes, or the pancreatic zymogens. And the other thing cholecystokinin is going to do is that it targets the stomach and it slows the stomach down. It decreases function or decreases gastric activity so that the stomach doesn't overwhelm the small intestine. The other hormone that I'm going to talk about right now is called secretin. So secretin comes from the enteroendocrine cells of the small intestine. Secretin targets the small intestine, targets the pancreas. It targets the pancreas, and the pancreas then releases bicarbonate, which is a buffer. So we're going to buffer the contents that comes in from the stomach from 1 to 2 up to about 8. Now, we don't have pits in the wall of the intestines. They're called crypts. So they're intestinal crypts. And all these cells, the goblet cells, the enteroendocrine cells, are located inside of the intestinal crypts. All right, now we can see the villus. So here's one villus right here. There's a finger-like projection. We can see the absorptive enterocytes all the way around it. And then the core and the inside of the small intestine. That's where we find the blood capillaries and the lymphatic capillaries. The blood capillaries are going to absorb the amino acids and the monosaccharides that pass into the core. And then lacteal is going to absorb the fats that have been absorbed into the core. And then on the outer part of the cell is the microvilli. These hair-like extensions then will touch and do contact digestion. If you look inside of the small intestine, you have it in this picture right here, it kind of looks like a shag carpet lines the inner lining. So the main functions of the large intestine, we're going to absorb water and electrolytes. The lining of the large intestine lined with bacteria as well. This is called the bacterial flora. And the bacterial flora can break down some cellulose, which is a plant sugar, but it can also break down some more food stuff in order to absorb vitamins like vitamin K. Now, once it's in the large intestine, it doesn't do peristalsis anymore. They're called mass movements. Peristalsis occurs 24 hours a day, all the time, unless there's no food stuff in the stomach. If there's no food stuff in the stomach, it does another type of movement called the motor migrating complex. We'll worry about that in physiology. But the large intestine, the main means of propulsion in the large intestine is called the mass movement. And you only have 3 or 4 mass movements a day. And as the mass movement means, it's going to move through most of the intestines all at once. All right, the parts of the large intestine. We'll start with the cecum. The cecum is the part of the large intestine that is attached to the ileum of the small intestine. So the cecum is the first section of the large intestine that the feces are going to be in. There's a piece of lymphatic tissue that hangs off of the cecum. It's called the appendix. After the appendix, we have most of the colon. We have the ascending colon, and we have the descending colon. Then we have the transverse colon. Actually, I didn't do that in order. The ascending colon is first, and then it curves around through a flexure called the hepatic flexure. And then it goes across the gut in a transverse colon. And then there's another curvature called the splenic flexure. And then it goes down into a descending colon. The descending colon leads to an S shape in the colon known as the sigmoid colon. And then once it straightens out, the sigmoid colon becomes the rectum. Once the feces enters into the rectum, it starts the defecation reflex, and I have a picture of that later. And then the rectum leads to the anal canal, and the very end of the anal canal is the anus. Now, the other features of the large intestine that we don't see anywhere else, the longitudinal muscle is thickened in the middle. It kind of looks like a ribbon that goes through the entire large intestine, and it's called tinea coli. And it's the tinea coli that's responsible for the mass movements. Now, the tinea coli stays slightly contracted, and it forms these pouches along the large intestine, which we'll see when we get to that picture. These pouches are known as haustra. All right, so as we go through the large intestine after the rectum, we have the anal canal. The anal canal is lined with stratified squamous epithelium. So we had the non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium in the oral cavity, which is the mouth. We had it in the oropharynx, we had it in the laryngopharynx, and then it was also in the superior portion of the esophagus. After that, it transitions into simple columnar epithelium. It stays simple columnar through the stomach, through the small intestine, through most of the large intestine. And then when we get to the anal canal, it changes back into stratified squamous epithelium. All right, so here is the valve between the ileum and the cecum. This valve is known as the ileocecal valve. This ileocecal valve will open during something called the gastroileal reflex. Whenever food enters into the stomach, the nervous system triggers the opening of this valve so that we can allow what's in the last part of the ileum into the large intestine. So the very first part of the large intestine known as the cecum, so it's right here. Then we have the appendix, which is right here. And then we have the colon. After the cecum, we have the ascending colon coming up this way if you follow the red dot. And then here's the hepatic flexure. Then we have the transverse colon. Goes across the gut in a transverse direction. Then we have the splenic flexure. Then the descending colon. And as soon as it curves, it becomes the sigmoid colon. And then when it straightens back out, now it's the rectum. And then after the rectum is the anal canal. Now there are two valves associated with the anal canal. There's an internal anal sphincter and an external anal sphincter. This is showing the last part of the rectum up here, and then here's the anal canal. So we have the internal anal sphincter and we have external anal sphincter. The internal anal sphincter is involuntary, which means it stays closed all the time. Once feces enters into the rectum and is held by the rectal folds, then there's a signal that it relaxes the involuntary internal sphincter. Then we have the external anal sphincter right here, and that is voluntary, and it keeps it closed until you can reach or get to the bathroom. And then you'll see that the veins associated with the anal canal are called the hemorrhoidal veins, so that whenever they become distended after much straining, they become what is known as hemorrhoids, which can actually protrude out from the anus. So here's the opening to the outside, which is going to be the anus. I think in the study guide, unless I've taken it out, talks about the rectal valves. Inside of the rectum are three parts or segmentations they're called rectal valves. Here's one of them right here. There are a set of three. The importance of these rectal valves is that they can grab a hold of and grasp the feces so that it allows you to pass gas without losing a grip on the feces so that you don't poop your pants if you need to fart, just so you know. Alright, so here's showing you the defecation reflex. As soon as the feces passes from the sigmoid colon into the rectum, a signal is sent. There are receptors right here. As soon as this wall is stretched, it sends a signal in through the spinal cord, which then creates a movement. It comes through here. It'll slow down parts of the sigmoid colon, and then it'll also relax the internal anal sphincter, and then allows you to control the external anal sphincter right here. That's all part of the defecation reflex. It allows the brain to let you know when you need to go. The only secretions that are going to be are made by the large intestine are going to be the goblet cells. So the only secretion is going to be mucus to help line the inner lining and to lubricate the outside of the feces so that it passes easier. And then the anal canal, like I mentioned earlier, is lined with the simple squamous epithelium, but before that is going to be the simple columnar epithelium. So simple columnar epithelium is going to line the cecum, most of the colon, the rectum, and then when we get to the anal canal, it becomes stratified squamous epithelium. There are no villi in the large intestine. They stop at the ileum. All right, let's talk about the accessory organs of the alimentary canal. We'll start with the liver. The liver is the largest internal organ, and the only digestive function of the liver actually is the production of bile. Whenever red blood cells are broken down, some of the byproducts of breaking down red blood cells is called bilinogen. And bilinogen can either be excreted with the feces or it goes to the liver, and the liver changes it to bile. And bile breaks down fats. Fats, of course, are made of mostly cholesterol, and watery enzymes are unable to penetrate that fat layer. So it needs help, and so bile is actually cholesterol based. Now, the liver does many other metabolic functions like storing glucose, plus it makes plasma proteins, which is part of the blood, but there's a slide later that lists that out, so we'll just wait till we get to that. This is showing you the anterior surface of the actual liver and how large it is. Now the liver is separated into lobes, and we can see two large lobes here. This is the right lobe, which is the largest lobe of the liver, and then here's the left lobe, which is right here. The gallbladder is on the posterior and inferior surface of the liver. So the gallbladder is where we store bile. Sometimes the gallbladder becomes filled with stones called gallstones, and if they are too big to be passed, then they will go ahead and remove your gallbladder. So here's the posterior surface of the liver. This, again, is all right liver, right lobe of the liver right here. Right here is the left lobe of the liver. Now we can see two other lobes. This lobe that's up here is known as the caudate lobe, spelled right here, but this is the caudate lobe. And then right here is the quadrate lobe, right here. See this little white thing right here? This used to be part of the ductus venosus, which was part of the fetal circulation that becomes a ligament after birth. You see that the inferior vena cava passes right behind the liver. As it goes up, it makes its way up to the right atrium. There is an opening into the liver right here, and there are three vessels that open or bring stuff into or out of the liver, and they're known as the hepatic triad. We have the hepatic portal vein bringing nutrient-rich blood into the liver. We have the hepatic artery bringing oxygen-rich blood into the liver. And then we have the common bile duct, which is bringing bile out of the gallbladder or liver right here. There's a duct that goes from the common bile duct to the gallbladder. This is known as the cystic duct right here. And then we have a left hepatic duct and a right, I'm sorry, I did that wrong. Here's the left hepatic duct, here's the right hepatic duct. They form the common hepatic duct. The common hepatic duct and the cystic duct, they come together to form the common bile duct. And then the common bile duct is going to go all the way down and then empty into the duodenum at the major papilla through the hepatopancreatic sphincter. Well, in case you didn't catch it on the previous slide, the portal triad is part of the bile duct, part of the hepatic portal vein, and part of the hepatic artery. The blood vessels, the hepatic portal vein and the hepatic artery, is bringing blood into the liver. The liver is going to process the blood. It's going to take out the nutrients from the hepatic portal vein, plus there's some nutrients still coming in through the hepatic artery, and it's going to take the oxygen coming in through the hepatic artery. It's going to take the bilinogen coming in through the hepatic artery. And then the bile duct is going to exit the portal triad to empty into either the gallbladder cystic duct or into the common bile duct. And this is the slide that mentions the different functions of the liver. There, it produces the blood proteins or the plasma proteins. Do you remember the plasma proteins from the chapter on blood? We had albumin, which creates an osmotic pressure to bring fluid back into the system from the capillaries. We had globulin, which is used as a generic antibody. And there's fibrinogen, which is used as a clotting plasma protein. And then, of course, there's the part that produces the bile. The liver is a detoxifying organ. It detoxifies poisons, things that are bad for the body, which include drugs and alcohol. So, peroxisome is the organelle of a cell that detoxifies the cell. So, most of the peroxisomes are found in the liver, which is how they detoxify your blood. Most sugar is stored in the liver. It's stored as glycogen, so most of the glycogen stores are in the liver. The liver is targeted by glucagon in between meals so that it'll break down the glycogen and release the glucose into your bloodstream whenever your blood sugar starts to get low. And then the liver has the great capacity to regenerate. You can actually donate a third or up to a third of your liver, and then that third will grow back. So the liver can grow back after you've donated part of it to somebody else. I think a part of the study guide says to know the anatomy of the hepatic lobule. The hepatic lobule is the functional unit of the liver. So the liver is broken down into lobes, and then each lobe is broken down into hepatic lobule. So here's the hepatic lobule. It is a six-sided figure and is made of plates of cells known as hepatocytes. These hepatocytes are the liver cells that are doing all of the detoxifying, storing of glucose, making plasma proteins, so on and so forth. So these are the plates of the hepatocytes. At each corner of the hepatic lobule is a series of 3 vessels. There's a branch off of the hepatic portal hepatic portal vein. There's a branch off the hepatic artery, and there's a branch of the bile duct right here. So we have blood coming in from the hepatic artery. It makes its way through the hepatic plates or hepatocytes. By the time it reaches the blood vessel in the very center, it has delivered the oxygen and picked up carbon dioxide. So the vessel in the very center of the hepatic lobule is known as the central vein. So blood flows from the hepatic artery to the central vein. Now the blood from the hepatic portal vein is also going in the same direction. The blood from the hepatic portal vein goes into the hepatic lobule, and all the nutrients are being processed. So then by the time blood reaches the central vein, it's now nutrient poor. Now the hepatocytes are producing bile. Bile is going to go in the opposite direction. Bile is going to exit the hepatic lobule through the corner right here, and then the bile ducts will all come together to form the common bile duct eventually. But this central vein right here, all the central veins of the hepatic lobules come together to form the hepatic vein. And then the hepatic vein feeds into the inferior vena cava. All right, then we have the gallbladder. The gallbladder is in the upper right quadrant. The function of the gallbladder is to store and concentrate the bile. So the bile that comes from the liver is kind of watery. Once it reaches the gallbladder will absorb some of the water and concentrate the bile so that it's released in a more concentrated form. The function of bile is to break down fat. That's called emulsify. So it emulsifies the fats. Now the gallbladder will contract in the presence of a hormone known as cholecystokinin. We talked about cholecystokinin earlier. It's the hormone that comes from the duodenum. Cholecystokinin is going to target the gallbladder, make it contract so they can squirt just a little bit of bile into the duodenum whenever chyme is moved from the stomach into the duodenum. Now remember, there are 2 other functions of cholecystokinin. What are they? I mentioned them previously in the slide, so you can go back and look at them then. I'm not going to go over them again. But cholecystokinin has 3 functions, 3 targets. All right, we looked at this picture earlier. Here is the gallbladder right here. It's producing, it concentrates the bile. And then here's the liver. The liver makes the bile. The liver is passed from the hepatic duct into the cystic duct, which leads to the gallbladder. Now the cystic duct joins with the hepatic duct to form the common bile duct. So here's the common bile duct. It brings bile down and then empties through into the duodenum through the hepatopancreatic sphincter. Now here's the pancreas. We'll go ahead and look at that. We're about to talk about the pancreas when I switch slides. The parts of the pancreas include this part that sits in the crook of the duodenum, known as the head of the pancreas. And then the main part of the pancreas is known as the body of the pancreas. And the very end of it is known as the tail of the pancreas. The tail of the pancreas is actually in real close proximity to the spleen, which is in the upper left quadrant. Alright, so like I mentioned before, the pancreas is both an endocrine and an exocrine gland. The endocrine function of the pancreas is to produce hormones known as insulin and glucagon. Now we went over these in chapter 17 when we did the endocrine system. Insulin is released by the beta cells of the pancreatic islets, and insulin is going to lower your blood sugar. So after you eat a meal, insulin is released so that it'll lower your blood sugar. Glucagon is released by the alpha cells of the pancreatic islets, and glucagon is going to raise your blood sugar. So in between meals, when your blood sugar has been lowered, glucagon will move in and raise your blood sugar levels. The exocrine function of the pancreas comes from the acinar cells, A-C-I-N-A-R. Most of the cells of the pancreas are acinar cells, and they produce the digestive enzymes like pancreatic amylase, pancreatic lipase, pancreatic proteases. The proteases break down proteins, and they're released in the inactive form known as zymogens. And then there are hormones produced by the duodenum that will activate the pancreatic enzymes. Alright, you can look at the last few slides. They just mentioned everything that I talked about. But this is where I'm going to stop with the digestive system. So this is all part of the final, and then the last two chapters, which are going to be the urinary system and the reproductive system. Email me if you have any questions.